She looked me dead in the eyes, mud on her boots, and zero patience in her voice, and said, "This is no place for princesses." And I stood there. Pink coat, white fur trim, Chanel bag, 3 suitcases, in the middle of a Texas winter thinking, she is absolutely right, and I am absolutely not leaving. Before I tell you what happened next, and trust me, a lot happens next, hit subscribe if you're new here, and drop a comment. Team Reagan or Team Isa? I need to know whose side you're on before this story is over. I want to be very clear about something before I tell you this story. I am not the kind of person who cries in a rental car. I have standards. I have a skincare routine. I have a playlist specifically curated for moments when life falls apart. It's called Not Today Feelings, and it has 47 songs on it. I was on song number 3 when I saw the sign. Santa Clara Ranch, private property. Weathered wood, crooked post, barbed wire on both sides of a dirt road that disappeared into a gray Texas morning like it didn't want to be found. My GPS said I had arrived. My entire body said this was a mistake. Let me back up. 3 days before, I was sitting in my father's office in Miami, the kind of office that has its own zip code, waiting for him to explain why he'd called me in like I was being summoned to the principal. My father, Eduardo Monteiro, does not call meetings for small things. He calls meetings when your life is about to change and he's already decided in which direction. He slid a folder across the desk. Santa Clara Ranch, Hill Country, Texas. 200 acres. Cattle and hay operation. Active since 1987. I looked at him. He looked at me. I said, "Dad, I didn't know we owned a ranch." He said, "That's exactly the problem, Isabela." The deal was simple, in the way that only my father's deals are simple, meaning they are not simple at all. The ranch had a debt, a supplier negotiation that had gone cold because the other party, a man named Holt who owned the property next door, refused to sit across the table from my father after some falling out years ago. But he would sit across from a Monteiro. Just not that one. So, me, 1 month on the ranch, learn the operation, represent the family in the negotiation, or lose the Miami apartment, the one my father co-signed, the one I had convinced myself was mine. I told myself it was fine. I told myself it was a business trip with a rustic aesthetic. I packed accordingly, which means I packed for every possible scenario except the correct one, which was, it will be 38 degrees, and there will be mud everywhere, and no one will care about your coat. The coat, for the record, was a mistake. I stand by completely. Pink wool, white fur collar and cuffs, matching hat, little gold buttons. I bought it in New York in November, and I had worn it exactly once. I wore it that morning in the rental car, because I wanted to feel like myself when I arrived somewhere that was going to make me feel like nothing I recognized. I pulled up to the main gate at 9:14 a.m. and sat there for a full minute before getting out of the car. The air hit me first, cold and clean in a way that Miami air simply isn't, carrying something like pine and something like earth and something I didn't have a word for yet. The sky was enormous. I had never thought of sky as something that could be enormous before. In Miami, you see it between buildings. Here it just went, in every direction. Forever. I heard her before I saw her, boots on frozen ground, steady and unhurried, the way someone walks when they own every inch of space they're moving through. And then Reagan Duarte came around the side of the fence post and stopped, and looked at me, and I watched her take in the full picture. The coat, the hat, the 3 rolling suitcases in coordinating blush pink. And something moved across her face that was not quite a smile and not quite a grimace. It was something more complicated than both. She had a black hat pulled low, a flannel shirt rolled to the elbows despite the cold, jeans that had seen actual work, and boots with actual mud on them. And she stood there with her arms loose at her sides like someone who had never been uncomfortable in their life and didn't intend to start. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said it, flat, unhurried, without cruelty, but also without any particular warmth. This is no place for princesses. And I looked right back at her, pulled my fur-trimmed sleeve up to check my watch, and said, "Good thing I'm not here to play princess. I'm here because I own half of what you're standing on. So, where do I put my bags?" The first thing Reagan said to me the next morning was not, "Good morning." It was, 4:30, barn, don't wear the pink coat. She was already gone before I could respond. I stood in the doorway of the guest room, which was clean and warm and perfectly fine, and which I had spent 20 minutes finding things to complain about before giving up, and stared at the darkness outside the window. 4:30 in the morning is not a time I had previously understood to exist in any practical sense. In Miami, 4:30 is when you consider going home from wherever you are. In Santa Clara Ranch, apparently, it was the beginning of the workday. I sat on the edge of the bed for a moment and had a very serious conversation with myself about my life choices. I wore the pink coat anyway. I want to be clear that this was not defiance. It was the only coat I had. The barn was already alive when I got there, and I mean that in the most literal, overwhelming sense. The smell hit me first, which I will not describe in detail out of respect for anyone eating while watching this. Then the sound. Low, restless movement. The shift of large bodies in small spaces. Breath visible in the cold air. Reagan was already working, and she moved through that space the way water moves through rock, like she had done it so many times that the path had simply formed itself around her. She didn't look up when I came in. Aunt Lorraine appeared from nowhere approximately 4 minutes later, which I would learn was her signature move. She came around a corner with a thermos of coffee and looked at my coat and then at my boots. I had worn ankle boots because I owned no other kind, and she said, in the most loving voice imaginable, "Baby, those are not ranch boots." Then she handed me the coffee and patted my arm like I was a very well-dressed lost cause. Reagan gave me a task. It was a simple task. It involved moving a specific group of cattle from one pen to another, following a specific route, making specific sounds to direct them. She explained it twice, slowly, clearly, the way you explain something to someone you are not confident will understand it. I understood it perfectly. I then proceeded to execute it with a confidence that was, in retrospect, completely unearned. The cattle did not move where I directed them. The cattle moved where the cattle wanted to move, which was in the opposite direction, toward me, in a mass of hooves and breath, and zero respect for personal space. I backed up. I backed up further. I made the sounds Reagan had described, which did nothing. I made additional sounds that I invented on the spot, which also did nothing. I ended up pressed against the fence with approximately 800 pounds of indifferent livestock between me and any reasonable exit. Reagan appeared. She didn't run. She walked, which somehow made it worse, because it meant this was not an emergency to her, just an inconvenience. She moved through the cattle like they weren't there, redirected them with 2 gestures and a sound I had not been taught, and then she was next to me, one hand on the fence beside my shoulder, close enough that I could see the cold had turned her cheeks red under the brim of that black hat. She looked at me. I looked at her. She said, "You okay?" Not warmly, not unkindly, just factually, the way you ask if a piece of equipment is still functional. I said yes. She nodded and started to turn away. And then, without fully deciding to, I said, "Thank you." And she stopped. Just for a half second, just long enough to matter. Then she kept walking. Aunt Lorraine had watched the whole thing from a safe distance with her coffee and an expression of pure entertainment. When Reagan was out of earshot, she appeared at my elbow and said, "She doesn't help people she doesn't care about, you know. She'd have just waited for you to figure it out." I told her that was not the comfort she seemed to think it was. She laughed like I'd said the funniest thing she'd heard all week. That night I sat on the guest room floor with my laptop, looking up cattle management basics on YouTube at 11 p.m., taking notes in the same notebook I used for Fashion Week schedules back in Miami. I told myself it was strategy. I told myself I needed to understand the operation for the Holt negotiation. I told myself it had nothing to do with the fact that Reagan had looked at me that morning. Really looked, past the coat and the boots and the manicure, and waited to see what I was made of. I told myself all of that very convincingly. I almost believed it. I had been at Santa Clara Ranch for 11 days when I stopped counting the days. I'm not sure exactly when it happened. Somewhere between learning the difference between a heifer and a cow, which Reagan explained with the patience of someone who has accepted that not everyone was born knowing things, and the morning I woke up at 4:15 without an alarm and didn't even question it. I just got up, put on the layers, went to the barn. Aunt Lorraine had coffee ready and didn't say anything about it, which meant she noticed everything and was storing it for later use. Reagan had started talking to me more. Not much. She was not a woman who used words carelessly, which I found both frustrating and quietly fascinating, because I had spent my whole life around people who used words as furniture, filling up space so no one would notice there was nothing underneath. Reagan said things when she had something to say, which meant that when she spoke to me directly, I listened in a way I didn't usually listen to people. I noticed this about myself and filed it under things to examine later, possibly never. The morning Holt showed up was a Tuesday. He wasn't supposed to come until the formal meeting the following week. That was the plan. That was the timeline I had been preparing for, practicing in my head while I fell asleep at night, running through numbers and acreage and supply terms like a very anxious, very pink-coated law student. But Holt was the kind of man who treated other people's schedules as suggestions that applied to other people. He drove up in a truck that cost more than some houses and climbed out like he owned the ground he stepped on, which, technically, on his side of the fence, he did. He was in his 60s, thick through the shoulders, the kind of tan that comes from decades outdoors rather than a vacation. He shook Reagan's hand first, which told me everything about how he saw the situation. Then he turned to me with the particular smile men like him reserve for people they've already decided don't matter. "So you're the Monteiro girl," he said. Not unkindly, just dismissively, in a way that was almost worse than unkind because it didn't even consider me worth the energy of disrespect. Eduardo's daughter, the one from Miami. He said Miami the way people say it when they mean, "And what exactly do you know about anything?" I opened my mouth. Reagan spoke first. "She runs point on the negotiation," Reagan said. Her voice was the same temperature it always was, even, unhurried, carrying no heat and requiring none. "She knows the operation. She knows the numbers. And she's been here long enough to know what this land is worth." She paused. "Which means she's exactly who you should be talking to." Holt looked at her for a moment. Reagan looked back with the specific expression of someone who has all day and no particular feelings about how it goes. He nodded slowly, reassessed me, and said he'd see us at the meeting next week. When his truck disappeared down the road, I stood very still and did not say anything for what was probably 15 seconds. Reagan picked up the fence tool she'd set down and went back to what she'd been doing. I walked over and stood beside her and said, "You didn't have to do that." She kept working. "No," she said. "I didn't." That night, for the first time, we sat on the porch together after dinner without it being awkward. It just happened. Aunt Lorraine had gone home. The ranch was quiet, and I came outside with 2 mugs of coffee and Reagan was already there, and I handed her one and sat in the other chair, and neither of us made it into a thing. The cold was sharp and clean. The sky above the hill country was obscene with stars, the kind of sky that makes you feel both very small and very awake. She asked me after a while what I actually wanted. Not from the negotiation, not from the ranch, just what I wanted. And the question caught me so completely off guard that I answered it honestly, which I almost never do. I said I didn't know. That I'd spent so long inside my father's version of my life that I wasn't sure I'd ever stop to build my own. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's the most honest thing you've said since you got here." I laughed. Actually laughed. Not the social kind. And she looked at me when I laughed, and then looked away, and something in the space between those two things felt like a door opening, somewhere neither of us was ready to walk through yet. Aunt Lorraine announced the dinner on a Wednesday morning with the energy of someone declaring a national holiday. She showed up at the barn at 7 a.m., which, after 11 days, I now understood to be mid-morning at a ranch, with a list of things she needed from the supply store in town, and a look on her face that meant the list was not the point. The point, I would understand later, was to get Reagan off the property for 2 hours, so Aunt Lorraine could cook in the ranch kitchen undisturbed and rearrange the dining table in a way that would force two specific people to sit across from each other. I say this not because I figured it out at the time. I say this because she told me directly, 3 weeks later, with zero remorse. The dinner was for 5. Aunt Lorraine, her husband Dale, a ranch hand named Cody who was 19, and said approximately 4 words the entire evening, Reagan and me. Dale was a large, quiet man who laughed at everything his wife said and seemed to find the whole of existence deeply satisfactory, which I respected enormously. Cody ate 3 plates of food and stared at his boots whenever anyone addressed him directly. Aunt Lorraine talked enough for all of them combined, which left Reagan and me in the unusual position of making eye contact across the table every time Lorraine said something that required a reaction neither of us knew how to provide. The food was extraordinary. I want to stay on this for a moment because it matters. Beef stew with cornbread, sweet potato casserole, green beans cooked with bacon, a pie that I still think about. I had eaten at restaurants with Michelin stars that did not produce the specific feeling of that meal in that kitchen, which probably says something about me or about kitchens or about both. Reagan ate with the focused appreciation of someone who works hard enough that food is never incidental. I found myself watching her hands around the coffee mug and then looking at my own food very quickly. After dinner, Aunt Lorraine assigned dishes with the casual authority of a general. Dale dried, Cody disappeared, and Reagan and I washed, side by side at the kitchen sink, which, and I cannot stress enough how much this had Lorraine's fingerprints on it, was a 2-person job, only if one of those persons was being deliberately inefficient with the drying towels. We didn't speak for the first few minutes. The kitchen was warm. The window above the sink was dark and fogged slightly with cold from outside. Then Reagan said, "Your father called the ranch in 2019. I looked at her. She kept her eyes on the plate she was rinsing. "Bad season. We were close to losing the herd. He said he'd send money. He didn't." She set the plate in the rack. I took a second job. Night shifts at a feed supply outside Fredericksburg. Drove 40 minutes each way, 4 nights a week, for 8 months. Kept this place running. She handed me the next plate. He called again in 2021 to say thank you. That was the last I heard from him until you showed up. I didn't say anything for a long moment. There was nothing to say that wouldn't have sounded like an excuse for someone else's choices, and Reagan wasn't asking for an explanation anyway. She was just telling me, filling in a gap she'd decided I deserved to know about. I understood in that moment, with the warm water running and the smell of Aunt Lorraine's pie still in the air, why Reagan had looked at me that first day the way she had. Not with contempt. With the specific exhaustion of someone who had held everything together alone and then watched the person whose name was on the deed show up in a fur-trimmed coat. "I'm sorry," I said. Not for my father. I couldn't carry that. But for my own absence. For 26 years of not knowing this place existed, not knowing what it had cost someone else to keep it alive. Reagan glanced at me sideways. "You didn't know," she said. "That's different from not caring." It was, I realized, the most generous thing she'd said to me since I arrived, which meant it cost her something to say it. We finished the dishes without talking much after that, but the silence was different from every silence that had come before it. It was the silence of two people who have said something real and are letting it settle. Aunt Lorraine appeared in the doorway, looked at us, looked at the clean dishes, and smiled the smile of someone whose plan has gone exactly as intended. "Coffee?" she said, as if she hadn't engineered the entire evening from the ground up. Dale appeared behind her with his quiet laugh. And Reagan, for the first time since I'd arrived, smiled, really smiled, the kind that reaches everywhere, and said, "Sure, Lorraine. Coffee sounds good." I watched her smile and thought, I am in so much trouble. The weather came in fast, the way Texas weather always does, like it doesn't believe in warnings. I had been at Santa Clara Ranch for 23 days when the storm hit, which meant I was close enough to the end of my month that I had started doing the thing I swore I wouldn't do, which was thinking about leaving. Not the way I'd thought about it on day one, when leaving felt like rescue. This was the other kind of thinking about leaving, the kind where you inventory what you'll miss, and the list gets longer than you expected, and you have to put the list away and go do something with your hands before the feeling gets a name. I had been doing a lot of things with my hands lately. I had learned to mend a fence. I had learned to read the sky. I had learned, slowly and imperfectly, and with more failures than I would like to admit, to move through this land like someone who belonged to it, even a little. Reagan had noticed. She hadn't said anything. She was not the kind of person who narrated your progress back to you. But I caught it in small ways. The way she'd started explaining things once instead of twice. The way she'd handed me the harder task without checking if I could handle it. The way, 2 days before the storm, she'd said "good call" when I suggested moving the younger cattle to the lower pasture ahead of a cold front, and then walked away before I could react, which was probably for the best, because my reaction would have been embarrassing. The storm announced itself at around 9 p.m., with a wind that came from nowhere and hit the ranch house like it had an argument to make. Reagan was already on her feet before I'd registered what was happening. She checked her phone, checked the sky through the window, and said, "The north galpon. The latch on the east wall is bad. If that wind gets under it, we lose the roof." She was already pulling on her jacket. I was already pulling on mine. She looked at me. I looked at her. She said, "You don't have to." I said, "I know." And I followed her out. The cold outside was a different animal from the cold I'd gotten used to. This had teeth. The wind pushed against us with something that felt personal, and the sky was the particular shade of green-black that I now knew, after 3 weeks in Texas, meant business. Reagan moved ahead of me with a flashlight. Her hat pulled low, and I stayed close. Not because I was scared, or not only because I was scared, but because the beam of her flashlight was the only fixed point in a landscape that had stopped being recognizable. The galpon was a 10-minute walk that took 20 in the wind. When we got there, the east wall latch was already straining, the metal singing against the frame with every gust. Reagan worked fast, both hands on the mechanism, braced against the wall. The flashlight wedged somewhere useful in a way that took her approximately 3 seconds to engineer. I held the door steady against the wind, which required everything I had, and then some. She didn't ask me to. I just did it. At some point, my hands were next to hers on the frame, and neither of us moved them away. The latch gave just as the rain started, not gradually, but all at once, the way Texas rain arrives, as if the sky decided and then committed completely. We got the door secured, and then we were inside and the storm was outside, and the difference between those two things was enormous and immediate. Reagan stood with her hands on her knees for a moment, catching her breath. I stood against the wall. The rain on the tin roof was so loud we would have had to shout to talk, so we didn't talk. We just breathed. Let our heart rates come down. Let our eyes adjust to the dark. The power went out 7 minutes later. I know because I checked my phone right before it happened, and then the flashlight was the only light in the world, Reagan sat down against the wall of the galpon, knees up, hat tipped back, and looked at the ceiling like it owed her something. I sat down next to her, not close enough to be a statement, close enough to be warm. Outside, the storm made itself known in every register. Wind and rain, and the occasional sound of something being relocated against its will. She talked first. Not about the ranch, not about the storm, not about logistics. She talked about her father, how he'd taught her every inch of this land before his hands gave out, how he'd made her promise to keep it alive, how she'd made that promise without understanding what it would cost her, how some nights she stood in the middle of the south pasture and talked to him out loud because it was the only place she felt like he could still hear her. She said it plainly, without apology, the way people talk in the dark when they've decided the dark is safe. I didn't fill the silence after. I let it be what it was. Then I talked. About my mother, who left when I was 7, and who my father never explained, and who I had spent 19 years pretending not to wonder about. About the apartment in Miami that I'd told myself was mine, but that had my father's name on every document. About the fact that I had arrived at this ranch 3 weeks ago, thinking I was being punished, and had slowly, without permission, started to feel more like myself here than I had in years. Reagan listened the way she did everything, completely, without interruption, without performing concern. Just present. Just there. At some point, the storm quieted to a low roar. At some point, Reagan's shoulder was against mine, and neither of us had moved to make that happen. It had simply become true, the way some things do in the dark when the guards come down and the cold makes closeness logical, and the heart does what it was going to do eventually anyway. I don't know when she fell asleep. I know her breathing changed, and her head tilted, and I stayed very still so I wouldn't disturb whatever this was. Outside, the rain kept falling. The tin roof kept singing, and I sat in the dark next to Reagan Duarte and thought, with a clarity that surprised me, I don't want to go back. When the morning came through the cracks in the galpon wall in thin, cold lines of light, we were still side by side. Neither of us had moved. She woke before me. I felt it in the change of her breathing, the slight shift of her weight. And for a moment, neither of us said anything. Just let the morning be what it was. Then she said, quietly, like she was still half in the dark, "You held that door." I said, "Yeah." She said, "Nobody asked you to." I said, "I know." And she nodded once, slowly, like something had been confirmed that she'd suspected for a while, but hadn't let herself believe. The morning after the storm, the ranch looked like it had been argued with and won. Branches down across the south fence. The old weather vane on the barn twisted 45 degrees from where it had always pointed. Mud everywhere in the particular total way that Texas mud operates. Not puddles, not patches, but a complete renegotiation of every surface. Reagan was already assessing damage when I came out, coffee in both hands, one mug extended in her direction before she asked. She took it without breaking her survey of the fence line. Our shoulders didn't touch. We didn't reference the night before, but something had shifted in the atmosphere between us, the way the air shifts after a storm. Cleaner, clearer, like everything that had been suspended had finally come down and settled. Aunt Lorraine arrived at 8 and took one look at both of us and said absolutely nothing, which was the loudest thing she had ever communicated. The Holt meeting was 4 days later, in a conference room at a lawyer's office in Fredericksburg that smelled like old wood and old money. I had spent those 4 days preparing with a focus that surprised even me, going through the ranch's financial records with Reagan every evening at the kitchen table, learning the supply chain, understanding the debt structure, mapping the negotiation points. Reagan knew the operation. I knew how to read a room. For the first time since I'd arrived, we were doing something genuinely together, and it felt, efficient wasn't the right word. It felt like what happens when two people who are good at different things stop working against each other. Holt came in with his lawyer and his certainty and his particular way of taking up space. He looked at me across the table, and I could see him recalibrating. I was not the Miami girl he'd dismissed in the mud 3 weeks ago. I had on a blazer I'd borrowed from a hook by the ranch door that may or may not have been Reagan's, boots that had actual mud history on them, and the specific expression of someone who has done the reading. I laid out the terms calmly and completely. When he pushed back, I didn't get smaller. When his lawyer tried a misdirection on the supply numbers, I caught it, named it, and moved on without making it personal. Holt looked at Reagan at one point, the way men like him do, looking for the real authority, the one he recognized. Reagan looked back with that even, unhurried expression and said, "She speaks for the ranch." 4 words. Holt nodded slowly and turned back to me. We had a signed agreement before noon. In the parking lot after, Reagan leaned against the truck and looked at me for a long moment. The hill country spread behind her, brown and gold in the winter light, the sky its enormous self. She said, "Your father's going to be pleased." I said, "Probably." She said, "What about you?" And there it was again. That question, the one she'd asked on the porch weeks ago, that she kept returning to like she actually wanted to know the answer and was willing to wait for a real one. I told her the truth. I said, "I don't want to go back to Miami." She was quiet. "The month is up in 3 days," she said. Not as a dismissal, as a fact she was laying on the table between us, carefully, to see what I'd do with it. I said, "I know." She looked at the mountains on the horizon. I looked at her. I said, "This ranch has a lot of problems. The east wall latch, the south fence. The Holt agreement needs to be monitored for at least a year. And someone needs to be here who actually knows what my father's name on that deed means." A pause. "That's a business case," she said. "Yeah," I said. "It is." She looked at me then. "Is that all it is?" And I said, "No, but I thought I'd start there." Reagan Duarte did not sweep anyone off their feet. She was not that kind of person, and I would not have believed it if she were. What she did was push off the truck, close the distance between us in 2 steps, and stand close enough that I had to tilt my chin up to hold her gaze. And she said, quietly, like something she'd been turning over for a while and had finally decided was true, "You held that door in the dark in the middle of a storm, without being asked. That's not nothing, Isa." I said, "No, it's not." The kiss was not dramatic. It was not the kind that gets scored with swelling music. It was the kind that happens when 2 people have been honest enough, for long enough, that the moment arrives not as a surprise, but as an exhale, like something that had been held carefully finally being set down. Her hand came up to my face, cold from the winter air, and I leaned into it, and the hill country was quiet around us, and that was enough. That was exactly enough. I called my father that night from the ranch kitchen while Reagan was outside doing the last check of the evening. He was pleased about Holt, as predicted. He asked when I was coming home. I told him I was going to stay on for a while, to monitor the agreement, to oversee some repairs, to learn the rest of what I didn't know yet. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Your mother loved that ranch, you know, when we were young." It was the first time he had mentioned her in 19 years. I didn't know what to do with that, so I held it carefully and told him I'd call next week. Reagan came back inside and found me still sitting at the kitchen table with my phone in my hand. She didn't ask. She put the kettle on and got 2 mugs from the shelf, and the domesticity of it, the simple, ordinary normalness of 2 people in a warm kitchen at the end of a hard day, hit me somewhere under the ribs with a force I hadn't expected. I thought about Miami, the apartment, the restaurants, the playlist called Not Today, feelings that I had not opened once in 23 days. I thought about the sign at the end of the dirt road that had looked like a mistake when I first saw it. Aunt Lorraine called the next morning to ask how the meeting went. I told her we got the agreement. She said, "That's not what I'm asking about, baby." I laughed. She laughed. I told her to mind her business. She said, "Honey, this is my business. I have been waiting on this since day 3. Then she hung up, and I stood in the doorway of the ranch house with the cold morning air on my face, and the smell of coffee from inside, and Reagan somewhere behind me starting the day, the way she always started it. Steadily, without fanfare, like someone who knows exactly where she belongs. And I thought, I think I might be starting to know too. That's the whole story. Well, the beginning of the whole story. If you made it this far, you already know. Hit subscribe, because there's more where this came from. And tell me in the comments, what was the moment you knew? For me, it was the door. It's always the door.